The Colosseum, Rome. The year is 73 after the death of Christ. It is midday, and the summer sun beats down mercilessly on 50,000 spectators, packed into stone seats that radiate heat like a furnace. The roar of the crowd is deafening, a physical force that seems to shake the very sand covering the arena floor. In the center of this chaos stands a woman, utterly alone. Chains hang from her wrists and ankles. Her name is Lucia. She is 19 years old, the daughter of a Roman senator who backed the wrong side in a recent political dispute. Just 3 days ago, she lived in a villa with marble floors, surrounded by slaves who attended to her every need. 2 days ago, soldiers stormed her home and arrested her entire family on charges of treason. Yesterday, her father and brothers were executed, quick death that Roman law considered merciful for citizens of their class. But Lucia is not going to die quickly. She is going to be humiliated. She wears a thin tunic, soaked with water, making it transparent and clinging to her skin. This is deliberate. Around her neck hangs a wooden placard, words painted in stark red. Traitor's daughter who thought herself above Roman law. The crowd reads it, and their roaring intensifies. They did not come here to see mercy. They came to see shame transformed into spectacle. 4 men enter the arena. They are not gladiators. They are not soldiers. They are actors, hired from one of Rome's theatrical companies specifically for this performance. They carry props, a crude wooden throne, mockeries of imperial regalia, a whip designed not to kill, but to mark. The crowd understands immediately what entertainment has been planned. Lucia does not yet know the specific details of what the next 3 hours will entail, but she understands the essential, horrifying truth. She is going to be forced to perform her own degradation for the amusement of 50,000 witnesses. Everything that gave her identity, her dignity, her sense of self, is about to be systematically destroyed in the most public way imaginable. The destruction will be so complete, so thorough, so carefully designed, that even if she survives physically, the person who entered this arena will cease to exist. The lead actor approaches her with the wooden throne. He speaks loudly enough for the nearest spectators to hear, his words spreading through the crowd in waves. The traitor's daughter thought herself a queen. Let us show Rome what happens to false queens. The crowd erupts in approval. This is not random violence. This is not spontaneous cruelty. This is calculated, systematic, carefully choreographed public humiliation, a ritual Rome has refined into an art form over centuries. What happens to Lucia in the next 3 hours has been planned by officials, rehearsed by performers, and designed to send a specific, chilling message to everyone watching. The Roman system of public humiliation was as sophisticated as their engineering, as brutal as their military conquests, and as enduring as their architecture. And here is what they never taught you in history class. You know about the gladiatorial games, the chariot races, the bread and circuses that kept the population entertained. You know about Roman military conquests, their roads and aqueducts, their law codes that influenced Western civilization. You have seen romanticized versions of Rome in movies and television shows, focusing on heroic figures and dramatic battles. But you have never learned about the systematic public humiliation rituals that Rome used to maintain social control. You have never heard about the deliberate protocols designed to destroy individuals so completely that their suffering served as a warning to entire populations. You have never discovered why Roman sources described these spectacles with the same clinical precision they used for engineering projects, as if destroying human dignity was simply another technical challenge to be solved efficiently. Tonight, you will discover what Roman law prescribed for public humiliation and why these rituals were considered essential to maintaining order. You will see how these practices were systematized, with specific protocols documented in legal texts and administrative records. You will learn what Roman historians, philosophers, and officials wrote about the purposes and methods of public degradation. You will understand why archaeological evidence confirms that humiliation spectacles occurred daily across the empire on a massive scale. And you will hear how survivors who recorded their experiences described psychological damage that modern trauma experts immediately recognize. If you want to understand the real history of Rome beyond the sanitized versions taught in schools, then journey with us now. Let us begin with what you thought you knew about Roman spectacles, and then systematically dismantle those comfortable assumptions with evidence preserved in Roman sources. For 2,000 years, the Romantic narrative tells us that Roman games were primarily about entertainment and spectacle, giving the masses what they wanted to keep them happy and docile. But the actual reality, which legal texts and historical accounts reveal, is that entertainment was only one function of a comprehensive system designed to demonstrate power, enforce social hierarchy, and make resistance to Roman authority psychologically devastating. The scale of Roman public humiliation is difficult for modern people to comprehend. Rome at its height ruled approximately 50 million people across an empire spanning from Britain to Mesopotamia, from North Africa to the Rhine. Maintaining control over this vast territory with relatively limited military forces required sophisticated systems of psychological control. Public humiliation was not peripheral to Roman power, it was central to it. The Colosseum in Rome, completed in 80 AD, could hold 50,000 spectators. But it was only the largest of hundreds of amphitheaters built across the empire. Every major city had facilities for public spectacles. Smaller towns had theaters or open spaces where humiliation rituals could be performed for local audiences. The infrastructure required to implement these systems empire-wide reveals their strategic importance to Roman governance. The theoretical framework was sophisticated and openly discussed by Roman writers. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, wrote extensively about the purposes of public humiliation. He argued that witnessing the degradation of those who violated social norms reinforced proper behavior in observers. Cicero, the orator and statesman, discussed how public spectacles created emotional bonds between the state and the population through the shared experience of witnessing punishment. Roman legal theorists wrote that the severity of punishment should be proportional not just to the crime, but to the social status of the criminal, with humiliation serving as the appropriate punishment for those whose crimes were against the social order rather than against individuals. This reveals something crucial. The Romans thought deeply about why they humiliated people publicly. They analyzed it. They debated optimal methods. They wrote treatises about psychological effects. This was not sadism disguised as justice. This was social engineering implemented through carefully designed rituals. The legal framework established specific categories of humiliation for different crimes and different social classes. Roman law distinguished between citizens and non-citizens, between freeborn and freed, between upper and lower classes. The type of humiliation deemed appropriate varied based on these distinctions. A senator convicted of treason faced a different humiliation than a freedman convicted of theft, who faced a different humiliation than a slave convicted of rebellion. The system was precisely calibrated to enforce hierarchy. The economic framework made humiliation spectacles profitable. The Roman state did not bear all the costs. Wealthy individuals sponsored spectacles to gain political favor and public recognition. Entrepreneurs bid for contracts to provide performers, animals, and victims. A sophisticated market existed for supplying everything needed for elaborate humiliation rituals. This created economic incentives for the system to expand rather than contract. The administrative infrastructure was extensive. Officials called editors organized spectacles, with the authority to requisition resources and condemned criminals. Records tracked which criminals were allocated to which spectacles, ensuring the efficient use of human resources. Professionals called laniste trained performers and managed logistics. The bureaucracy supporting public humiliation rivaled the bureaucracy supporting the military. Documentary evidence survived despite 2,000 years because Romans did not consider these practices shameful. They documented them proudly in historical chronicles, legal commentaries, philosophical essays, personal letters, graffiti on amphitheater walls, and administrative records preserved in stone and papyrus. When the Roman historian Tacitus describes humiliation spectacles, his tone is analytical, not critical. When Pliny the Younger writes letters describing elaborate humiliations he witnessed, he treats them as notable events worth recording for posterity. When legal texts specify appropriate humiliations for various crimes, the language is precise and clinical. Modern historians, analyzing these sources with fresh perspectives, recognize patterns that previous generations overlooked. The consistency across different types of sources, the systematic nature of the practices, the sophisticated reasoning behind design, choices all indicate that public humiliation was not incidental to Roman civilization, but fundamental to how Rome maintained control over its empire. The specific types of humiliation varied widely, but followed recognizable patterns. Forced performances, where victims were made to act out degrading scenarios. Exposure, where victims were displayed naked or nearly naked before crowds. Animal encounters, where victims faced beasts in ways designed to maximize terror and degradation rather than ensure a quick death. Mock ceremonies that parodied respected rituals to create maximum contrast between the victim's current state and their previous status. Physical markings that permanently labeled individuals as having been humiliated. Sexual violations performed publicly to destroy not just the victim, but their family's honor. Each type served a specific purpose. Forced performances demonstrated that victims could be compelled to actively participate in their own degradation, showing the absolute power of the state. Exposure destroyed the dignity associated with privacy and bodily autonomy. Animal encounters created a visceral spectacle that engaged audiences emotionally. Mock ceremonies used ritual forms that Romans respected to make the degradation more psychologically devastating. Through contrast, physical markings ensured the humiliation continued beyond the immediate event. Sexual violations destroyed family honor in cultures where honor was linked to the sexual purity of women and the sexual control of men. The sophistication reveals itself in the details. Roman spectacle designers understood that effective humiliation required careful calibration. Too much violence resulted in death, ending the spectacle prematurely. Too little resulted in audiences feeling unsatisfied, defeating the purpose. The optimal humiliation maximized psychological damage and audience engagement while keeping the victim alive and conscious. They also understood that effective humiliation required appropriate targeting.
Humiliating a member of the upper classes who thought their status protected them accomplished much more. It demonstrated that no one was beyond the state's reach. The most effective humiliations involved victims whose fall from privilege was dramatic and visible. Roman sources reveal something darker still. The empire learned through experience. Early humiliation spectacles were relatively crude and improvised. Over centuries, the system became refined through systematic observation of what worked, what maximized psychological impact, what created the most lasting deterrent effect, what kept audiences most engaged. Romans answered these questions through experimentation and implemented improvements based on the results. This was not primitive barbarism. This was the sophisticated application of psychological principles, discovered through empirical observation and refined through systematic implementation. The Romans pioneered techniques for destroying human dignity that modern research on psychological torture confirms are extraordinarily effective. They did this 2,000 years before modern psychology formally studied these mechanisms. Understanding this context is essential before examining individual cases, because it reveals that what happened to specific victims was not random cruelty or individual sadism, but the calculated implementation of systems designed at the highest levels of Roman government, discussed by leading intellectuals, and maintained through elaborate infrastructure across an entire empire for centuries. Now, let us return to Lucia in the Colosseum in 73 AD. She is 19, the daughter of Senator Marcus Octavius, who supported a failed conspiracy against Emperor Vespasian. Her entire family has been condemned, not just for treason, but for the arrogance of thinking they could challenge imperial authority. Lucia specifically has been selected for public humiliation because she represents the next generation that needs to learn absolute submission. The ritual that Lucia undergoes follows a pattern documented in multiple Roman sources describing similar spectacles. This was not improvised. This was protocol, refined through decades of implementation. The ritual began before she entered the arena, 3 days of preparation designed to break her psychologically before the public spectacle even started. She was held in cells beneath the Colosseum, where gladiators and condemned criminals awaited their fates. She was not harmed physically during these 3 days, but was subjected to constant psychological pressure. She could hear the roar of crowds above as other spectacles were performed. She could hear the sounds of animals in nearby cages, growling and pacing. She could hear screams from other prisoners. She was told repeatedly what awaited her in the arena, with details designed to maximize anticipatory terror. Sleep was disrupted randomly. Food was minimal.
The goal was to ensure she entered the arena already psychologically shattered, making the public ritual easier to execute. On the morning of her spectacle, she was bathed and dressed in the soaked tunic. The transparency was deliberate, creating immediate humiliation before any public ritual began. The placard was hung around her neck, heavy enough to be uncomfortable, positioned to force her head down in a posture of submission. When she was led through the tunnels toward the arena entrance, she had to pass other prisoners who would later face their own fates serving as a warning to them of what public humiliation entailed. The moment she entered the arena and 50,000 people saw her, the transformation from private person to public spectacle was complete. Every person in the Colosseum could see her humiliation. Many of them knew her family, knew her father, remembered when the Octavius family was powerful and respected. The contrast between her previous status and her current state was the essential element that made the spectacle effective. The 4 actors who entered the arena were professionals who specialized in these performances. They were not improvising. They had a script, choreography, specific beats they needed to hit for maximum audience engagement. The lead actor, a man named Quintus, who appears in other historical records as a frequent performer in humiliation spectacles, was skilled at reading both the victim and the audience, adjusting his performance to maximize impact. The wooden throne was placed in the center of the arena. Quintus forced Lucia to sit on it, then proclaimed in a voice trained to carry across the vast space, "Behold, the daughter of traitors who thought herself worthy of commanding Romans." The crowd's response confirmed this line had landed effectively. What followed was a 3-hour performance that Roman records describe as an elaborate demonstration of fallen pride. The actors forced Lucia to perform a series of actions designed to systematically destroy every element of her dignity and identity. She was made to perform mock coronation, where she was crowned with a wreath made of garbage and excrement. She was made to receive petitions from the actors playing common Romans, where she had to respond with scripted lines, acknowledging her family's crimes and her own unworthiness. She was made to perform banquet where she was served rotting food that she had to pretend to eat while praising its quality. Each scenario was designed to create a specific psychological impact. The mock coronation inverted the symbols of authority her class valued. The petitions forced her to speak words condemning herself and her family, making her complicit in her own humiliation. The banquet degraded the cultured dining that marked upper-class Roman life. Between these set pieces, the actors subjected her to more direct humiliations. They stripped away pieces of her clothing while delivering scripted lines about revealing the truth beneath false dignity. They applied substances to her skin that marked her visibly, including ashes that symbolized the destruction of her family's household gods. They forced her into positions of submission, making her kneel and prostrate herself repeatedly. The audience was not passive. They shouted suggestions for additional humiliations. They threw objects into the arena: vegetables, stones. Their participation was crucial to the spectacle's effectiveness. This was not just punishment administered by the state. This was the entire community participating in the enforcement of social norms. Roman sources note that Lucia dissociated partway through the spectacle. She began responding mechanically to commands, performing required actions, but showing no emotional reaction. The actors recognized this historical accounts suggest it was common. When victims dissociated, it reduced audience engagement because the spectacle became less emotionally resonant. The solution was to escalate. The final phase involved what Roman records describe euphemistically as full exposure to public judgment. She was completely stripped and positioned on a raised platform so all 50,000 spectators could see her clearly. She was required to remain motionless in this position while the lead actor delivered a speech about the consequences of betraying Rome. The speech lasted approximately 30 minutes. Modern psychologists analyzing historical descriptions of such events recognize this as among the most psychologically devastating elements. The combination of complete physical exposure, absolute loss of control, and a massive audience created trauma that few people could psychologically survive intact. The Roman designers of these spectacles understood this empirically, even without formal psychological training. After 3 hours, Lucia was removed from the arena. She was not executed, which might have been a mercy. She was released to survive with the memory of what had been done to her in front of 50,000 witnesses. This was deliberate. Living survivors of public humiliation served as ongoing warnings to others. Every time someone saw Lucia in Rome's streets, they would remember her humiliation. Her continued existence perpetuated the psychological impact of the spectacle beyond the 3 hours it lasted. Historical records indicate Lucia lived for another 11 years. She never married, which in Roman culture marked her as permanently damaged. She was economically dependent on distant relatives who resented supporting her. She lived in a single room in a poor district of Rome, dramatic fall from the villa where she had been raised. She died at age 30 of causes that historical records list as illness, but that modern analysis suggests was likely suicide or death from depression and malnutrition related to severe psychological trauma. Her story was preserved not because Roman historians sympathized with her, but because the spectacle was considered noteworthy. Multiple sources mention it as an example of Vespasian's effective handling of conspiracy threats. The historian Tacitus describes it as demonstrating an appropriate balance between severity and moderation, noting that executing the entire family, including daughters, would have seemed excessive, but that public humiliation achieved deterrence without bloodshed that might create martyrs. This reveals Roman thinking. Humiliation was not seen as cruel, but as sophisticated statecraft. It destroyed enemies, deterred potential rebels, entertained the masses, and avoided the political complications of execution. From the Roman perspective, what happened to Lucia was successful policy implementation. The spectacle served its purposes. No major conspiracies threatened Vespasian's rule for years afterward. Other noble families who might have considered opposition thought carefully about what might happen to their daughters if they failed. The population of Rome received entertainment and felt connected to imperial power through the shared witnessing of the spectacle. The system worked exactly as designed. Lucia was one woman among thousands subjected to similar public humiliation rituals during Vespasian's reign alone. Across the entire Roman Empire, over its centuries of existence, tens of thousands of people underwent various forms of public degradation. What happened to Lucia was not exceptional. It was standard operating procedure in a system that treated human dignity as a resource to be exploited for political purposes. Let us now pull back the curtain on the vast, cold machinery that made this degradation possible. To understand Rome is to understand that its cruelty was not a flaw, but a feature of a meticulously engineered system as complex as its aqueducts and as far-reaching as its roads. One of the most elaborate humiliation spectacles Rome ever produced was the triumph procession. This was not merely a victory parade. It was a systematic, choreographed narrative of total conquest, designed to break the spirit of defeated nations and exalt the power of Rome in the hearts of its citizens. A triumph was a ceremonial procession granted by the Senate to a victorious general returning from a major campaign. It was a rare and monumental honor. The triumph of Titus following the brutal conquest of Judea in 70 AD provides a chillingly detailed blueprint of how this system worked. The procession began outside Rome's sacred boundary and wound its way through the city for 3 miles, all the way to the Temple of Jupiter on Capitoline Hill. The route was lined with hundreds of thousands of spectators. A sea of humanity gathered to witness the spectacle of subjugation. The parade was a carefully ordered narrative. It began with military units, their armor gleaming. Then came floats displaying captured wealth chests of gold, precious art, symbols of plundered temples. Representations of defeated cities and battles followed, creating a visual story of Roman dominance. Then came the animals, exotic beasts from conquered lands. But the heart of the spectacle, its most crucial element, was the prisoners. They marched in positions meticulously designed to maximize their humiliation. Placed after the displays of captured wealth, they were visually equated with objects, mere spoils of war. They wore chains that were visible, but not so heavy they couldn't walk. A collapse would rob the audience of the full spectacle. They were dressed in their native clothing, which Romans found strange and mockable. The positioning was a hierarchy of shame. Lower-ranking prisoners marched earlier, a prelude to the main event. The highest-ranking captives, kings, generals, royal families were placed near the end, where the crowd's anticipation had built to a fever pitch. This demonstrated a key Roman insight. Effective degradation required the fall of the high and mighty. Josephus, a Jewish historian who witnessed Titus's triumph, provides a stark account. Simon Bar Giora, one of the rebel commanders, was forced to march through Rome with a rope around his neck, symbolizing that he was captured prey. As the procession reached the Forum, Simon was separated. A Roman official read the formal charges against him before the roaring crowd. Then he was led to the Mamertine prison, just off the Forum, and strangled. His execution was timed to coincide with the procession's climax. As Simon died in the darkness below, the general receiving the triumph could announce to the crowd that Rome's enemy had just been executed beneath their feet. The spectators' celebratory mood was amplified by this news. They stood literally above the site of death. This integration demonstrated a core Roman belief: killing an enemy was less important than humiliating him first. Other high-status prisoners from the Jewish revolt were not executed but kept alive for further degradation. Women from the royal Herodian family were forced to march in chains. Josephus records that they wept openly, which the spectators interpreted as an appropriate acknowledgement of defeat. The visible emotional breakdown of these protected, high-born women served Roman purposes perfectly. Even children of defeated leaders were included. Their humiliation sent a specific, brutal message. Resistance would endanger future generations. It destroyed the bloodline, continuity of enemy leadership, and created a particularly emotional spectacle, as Roman audiences were often more engaged by the suffering of children than that of adult men. The systematic nature of the triumph reveals itself in its rigid organization. The procession order was specified by tradition and law. The timing was choreographed. The visual presentation was designed to communicate a simple, brutal narrative. We conquered. We captured your wealth. We subjugated your people. We killed your leaders. We destroyed your future. Prisoners who weren't executed were often retained in Rome as living trophies. They might be brought out for games at the Colosseum or displayed at other public events. Some were eventually sold into slavery. To own a former king or noble as a household slave was a powerful status, symbol a constant, personal reminder of Rome's comprehensive victory. Hundreds of these triumphs occurred over the centuries. This was not occasional cruelty. It was regular, celebrated policy. The psychological impact on conquered peoples was documented by their own historians. Jewish, Greek, and Germanic sources all describe the profound, lasting trauma of witnessing their leaders paraded and broken. The consistency of these accounts confirms that Rome's systematic humiliation was a devastatingly effective weapon. But the arena held even more intimate horrors. One of the most infamous forms of Roman execution was damnatio ad bestia's, condemnation to the beasts. This was not simple execution. It was an elaborate spectacle designed to create maximum terror and humiliation before death. Damnatio ad bestias was reserved for specific outcasts, those convicted of heinous crimes who were not Roman citizens, religious dissidents like Christians who refused to recant, and rebels captured in provincial uprisings. The common thread was that these individuals were considered to have placed themselves outside civilized society, making them appropriate for treatment that emphasized their exclusion. The protocol had variations. The simplest involved releasing the sin, condemned, and animals simultaneously into the arena for a chaotic chase. But this was considered crude and unsatisfying. More elaborate versions were developed to maximize entertainment and psychological torment. One variation involved constraining victims to stakes or posts, forcing them to wait in terrified anticipation as animals were released and slowly approached. This visible terror was a key part of the show. Another variation forced victims to perform. They might be dressed as mythological figures doomed to be killed by animals, or given useless props like wooden swords, transforming their final moments into a grotesque, humiliating play. The case of Perpetua and Felicity, Christian martyrs executed in Carthage in 203 AD, provides a rare and powerful victim's perspective because Perpetua kept a diary of her imprisonment. Her testimony is a window into the soul of someone facing this engineered horror. Perpetua was a noble woman, 22 years old, nursing an infant. Felicity was her enslaved companion, pregnant when arrested. They were imprisoned with others for refusing to make a token sacrifice to the Roman gods. Their refusal was itself a humiliation to Roman authority, which is why their public degradation had to be particularly thorough. The case of Perpetua and Felicity, Christian martyrs executed in Carthage in 203 AD, provides a rare and powerful victim's perspective because Perpetua kept a diary of her imprisonment. Her testimony is a window into the soul of someone facing this engineered horror. Perpetua was a noble woman, 22 years old, nursing an infant. Felicity was her enslaved companion, pregnant when arrested. They were imprisoned with others for refusing to make a token sacrifice to the Roman gods. Their refusal was itself a humiliation to Roman authority, which is why their public degradation had to be particularly thorough. They needed to be broken so completely that their faith would appear futile to others. The spectacle was scheduled for the emperor's birthday games, deliberately integrating their execution into a larger celebration of imperial power. Before entering the arena, they were forced to dress in costumes associated with the pagan rituals they had rejected, a final, cruel mockery. In a gendered twist of the knife, the women were sent to face a wild cow, not a lion or leopard. A cow was considered less noble, but still capable of a violent, goring attack. The choice communicated that these women merited a less honorable death. They entered the arena dressed in nets, nearly naked, a humiliation that historical accounts suggest even some spectators found uncomfortable. When the cow was released, it gored Perpetua and trampled Felicity, but it failed to kill them quickly. Guards intervened, not out of mercy, but to manage the entertainment value. The spectacle was dragging. They were taken to a side area and finished off by gladiators with swords. Perpetua's diary describes her psychological state with heartbreaking clarity. She writes of feeling separated from her body, as if watching events happened to someone else. Classic trauma response known as dissociation. She focused on her faith to maintain coherence in the face of absolute degradation. The procedures before the execution were systematically designed to shatter the victims. They were given minimal food, weakening them. They were held where they could hear, but not clearly see, the horrors occurring in the arena, feeding their anticipatory terror. They were forbidden from comforting each other. Guards separated prisoners who tried to pray together or offer support. The goal was to ensure they entered the arena already psychologically broken. The administrative records that survived confirm the cold, businesslike nature of these spectacles. Officials called Lannistae managed the logistics. They maintained lists of available animals and coordinated schedules. They managed feeding schedules to ensure animals were hungry, but not so starved they would kill too quickly. Financial records show the economic calculations. Lions from Africa were expensive. Local bears were cheaper. The choice of which animal to use against which criminal was partly determined by the criminal's status. Higher status victims merited more expensive, dramatic animals. Humiliation was a product with a price tag. During periods of intense persecution, the scale of these executions became industrial. Under emperors like Decius and Diocletian, Thousands of Christians were executed using beast protocols across the empire. This required the coordinated management of animal supplies and the scheduling of spectacles in multiple cities simultaneously. Archaeology confirms this systematic cruelty. Excavations beneath amphitheaters reveal sophisticated holding areas for both animals and humans, designed to keep them separated until the dramatic reveal. Elaborate mechanical systems using lifts and trapdoors allowed for choreographed entrances from below the arena floor. The engineering genius devoted to facilitating humiliation reveals how central these spectacles were to the Roman world. The psychological impact rippled far beyond the immediate victims. Watching someone be reduced to helpless prey by animals communicated a terrifying message to any who might consider resistance. Rome could strip away anyone's civilization and dignity, reducing them to mere meat in their final, most public moments. Damnatio ad bestias continued until the Christian emperor Constantine banned it in the early 4th century. Yet, the ban was inconsistently enforced. The practice was so effective, so ingrained in the system, that its echoes persisted for centuries. It was a perfect tool for social control, and Rome never relinquished its perfect tools easily. But not all remain. Humiliation involved the roaring crowd and the sand of the arena. Some of its most devastating forms were quiet, legal, and permanent, following a victim for life, inescapable and utterly destructive. This was the system of infamia.